So let us listen for the word of God. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The names of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered the people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I had thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So you all can go back to your seats, or Jacob, if you want to go help Utopia, wherever you want to go is great. Where you will go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. I can't help but hear these words and think about a few of the weddings I've attended, where this beautiful scripture passage was used as the couple was embarking on a journey of marriage, setting a seal upon their hearts, dedicating themselves to one another in faithfulness and devotion. But I recall one wedding when I was in college where a snarky friend of mine who was sitting next to me leaned over and said, "Isn't this about a woman and her mother-in-law?" I said, "Well, yeah, but stop, it's so sweet, as I was dabbing tears from my eyes, so happy for this couple. It is a beautiful passage. And if you take those words, just in and of themselves, they're so lovely to think about with marriage, with romance. But if we sort of dig into the context here, if we take out that part about romance, we see that there's something much deeper going on with this text. If we just jump to that part about devotion and faithfulness without looking at what goes before it, we miss a big part of Ruth's story. As I mentioned before, the book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges. This was a bit of a dark period for the people of God. There were about 300 years of cycling through this rhythm of going into idolatry, straying from God, realizing they were wrong and repenting, turning back to God, but starting the cycle all over again. And those judges in charge were no help. They sort of made it worse. You could say these were dark times. And so then here's Naomi and her family in the midst of all of this. They're living in a foreign land. They had escaped that famine, and her husband dies. We're not told what happens. There's no details there. But the family carries on. The two sons find wives for themselves. They want to make sure they carry on the family line. It's important to note that the people at this time didn't believe in an afterlife. That concept of heaven and hell wasn't on their thinking. So what was important to them was keeping their family going, having people come behind them, their ancestors, that long family tree. That was how they established a presence for themselves on earth. Well, these young men find themselves Moabite women, locals to where they are living. Now remember, Naomi and her family are not at home. They're in the land of Moab. And ordinarily, it is a big no-no to marry a foreigner. You just didn't do that. The people wanted to preserve their tribes. They wanted to keep all of it in the family. But here we see these two Judean men marrying foreigners. And there's no condemnation for it. This is significant. In a way, it starts to overturn the way things are done. The people of God had this very narrow idea of how the world worked. And we start to see that crack a little bit. We know that the laws on marriage were clear, but like this instance, the people rebelled at times. They acted out and against those laws. It's not too different than in recent history here in America, when people found love in interracial relationships. They found that love even though the law told them they weren't allowed to. They pushed back against that unjust system. Well, Naomi's sons are doing that on some level, causing a tear in that fabric of injustice. Well, sadly, as we learn, the two sons die as well. We don't know the details. Again, we're not given that part of the story. But we're not told that it has anything to do with their wives, right? This isn't a punishment for marrying outside the tribe. But it certainly is sad for Ruth and Orpah, their wives. They've become widows so young. But it's especially sad for Naomi. Because the way things were done back then, a woman had to have a man in her life. Whether it was her father or her husband or her son, even a brother would do in a bind. But in order to have a place in society, she had to be attached to a man. She had to have him for protection and to provide for her needs. She could not survive on her own. Naomi is in trouble. Her daughters-in-law could just go back to their homes. They weren't bound by this law. They could go home and start over, find themselves new husbands, and start fresh. But Naomi can't just do that. She's bound by this law, that certain way that things were done back then. She can't just start over. She is desolate. If you think about it, she's sort of the female version of Job, that other character from the Old Testament. Job loses everything and is forced to start anew, and we see him wrestling with these questions of why did God do this? Why is this happening? Same thing goes for Naomi. But instead of carrying on for 40 chapters or so, Naomi gets to work figuring out what to do. She can't just sit there and grieve. She has to survive. So she hears a rumor that her home country is in better shape. The days of the famine are over, and maybe she could go back there and figure out a way to survive. She's suddenly filled with hope. She doesn't waste any time. She initially invites her daughters-in-law, but somewhere along the way, she changes her mind. Perhaps as she gets closer to home, she's realizing what they are about to face. Naomi, a childless widow, is going to face some obstacles for sure, but Orpah and Ruth, they're Moabites. They're not exactly going to be welcomed with open arms. There's not going to be a ticker-tape parade in their honor when they get to the land of Judah. Naomi must realize what they are walking into. So she turns to her daughters-in-law. She tells them to go back home. Go back to your families. Start over. And Orpah complies. I think sometimes she's viewed with disdain for walking away from Naomi so easily, but to be honest, she's doing Naomi a favor. It's going to be so much easier for Naomi to go by herself and not come back with these foreigners tagging along. Well, Ruth refuses. She gives that beautiful speech about devotion and faithfulness, promising to be Naomi's friend through thick and thin. And Naomi responds with silence and bitterness. I'm sort of reminded of that dynamic between Mr. Fredrickson and Russell in that movie Up, where Mr. Fredrickson has plans to go on this journey, and Russell is tagging along with him. He's not too thrilled. He gets a bit grumpy with that poor boy in that floating house. And I think Naomi gets a little bit grumpy when she realizes Ruth is with her. It's not going to look good when she gets back home with this Moabite. But Naomi agrees. She allows Ruth to come along, and we later learn that this is incredibly dangerous and risky. Ruth and Naomi are a lot like the thousands of refugees who are showing up at our southern border. Like Ruth, they have been through trauma. They've experienced violence and crime. They're leaving behind these hopeless situations that they cannot create a life in anymore, and so they come to our border seeking a new life, free from that violence they face at home. Sadly, our government is responding with resistance, decreasing the number of refugees we will take in, closing down the border, making it impossible to claim asylum. Our nation right now has a lot in common with the Judeans, the ones who were afraid of these foreigners, the ones who responded with outrage at the sight of a foreigner showing up at their border. If only those in power stopped to hear the stories, to understand the reasons these refugees are arriving at the border, that they have so much in common with Ruth and Naomi, a courageous set of women who have suffered. We often look at Ruth and admire her for being a devoted friend to Naomi, but there's so much more going on here. Womanist theologian Yolanda Norton points out that Moab is named 6 times alone in the chapter 1 of Ruth. That's sort of a clue. Something's going on there. The text is trying to tell us something. It's important that Ruth is a Moabite. Norton points out how Ruth is staking her claim as distinctly different than her ancestors. The Moabites carried this unfortunate reputation of Lot. If you recall his story from Genesis, he engaged in incest, and as a result, all of his ancestors carried the burden of that reputation. Ruth wanted to change that narrative for her people. She wants the world to see them differently. Norton sees an echo of this in her own work as a womanist theologian, feeling that call to push back, to change the narrative that the world has placed on Black women. In this act of sticking with Naomi, Ruth actually displays the tenacity and perseverance of the Moabites, a people who have been outcast, labeled unworthy, but who are strong in spite of all of that. Dr. Norton believes that Ruth is embracing that other status to keep her people moving forward. She is resisting this wave of discrimination and injustice so that she can thrive, so that maybe her people would be understood differently. And my, how she succeeds. You see, without Ruth, there would be no King David. She was his great-grandmother. And it's remarkable that there's an entire book written about his grandmother. He doesn't get his own book, by the way. There's no book of David in the Old Testament. It's as if to say that her life is no less significant than his. She was a stranger, an outsider, someone with nothing but her own force of character. Her refusal to walk away from another person's troubles spoke volumes. Here's David, this military hero, this political might, this king, and yet the Bible seems to be suggesting there's more than one form of greatness. There's more to it than having power and fame and renown. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs frames it, this greatness exists in simple deeds of kindness and friendship, generosity and grace. Rarely do they make the news, but they change lives, redeeming some of the pain of the human situation. Ruth exemplifies this greatness. And she does manage to change the narrative for her people. As a Moabite, as an outsider, she holds a place in the line of David, a family tree that would eventually include Jesus. At the heart of Ruth's story, we find redemption. Yes, her faithfulness brought Naomi out of despair. She was a good friend to her. But more importantly, we see her faithfulness as a testimony. We see her as perhaps the first convert to Judaism, the first outsider to make her way into God's family and stir things up, showing that being God's beloved people isn't about keeping others out. It isn't about building up walls and causing divides. Ruth's story shows us that all are welcome in God's family. And the fact that she's so celebrated, that she has her own book in the Bible, serves as a reminder that our understanding of who is in and who is out needs to expand. We can't just allow in those who look like us or come from similar backgrounds or vote for the same political candidates. Ruth's story shows us what it looks like to set that aside. She leaves behind her previous identity in order to embrace the Judean way. There was something about this faith that she found irresistible. And it was not easy for her to join God's family. She had to go through so many obstacles. But she did become one of God's beloved people. This courage of Ruth invites us to take a look at our own faith. It encourages us to deepen our understanding of who we are and who we are called to be, calling us to a new appreciation of the beautiful diversity that makes up the tapestry of God's beloved people. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen.